or yes, it's still morning. I was gonna say. As by way of a little bit of introduction, I started my career in computer science, and I was a software engineer in Silicon Valley for a little while, and then I decided to do a career switch, and I started learning about planning, and I went to planning school, and then I found, well, hello, there's modeling, which is kind of both computer science and planning together in one perfect combination. So I became a modeler, I don't know, 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And my first job was at the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. So I started with travel modeling there. When I came to MTC, was doing travel modeling for a while, and now I manage the forecasting, modeling, and surveys team. So that includes the regional economic modeling process and the land use modeling process and travel modeling process, as well as the survey work that informs all of the above. So with that, I will share.
We could probably give you a whole agenda yourself to cover everything you do down there. But
I'm still learning more and more about the regional economic modeling and the land use forecasting side. So I would say I'm still more of a travel modeler than the others, but it's
all right.
Fun.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here. These are your people then.
Yes. Yeah. So it sounds like there's a lot of expertise in this group. With that, I will talk about our, we call it our project performance assessment. And hold on, I'm scrolling around with my screen to get my stuff situated here. So you can see this PowerPoint, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. So, so we call this project performance. It's one phase of the Horizon Plan Bay Area 2050 planning process, which we are aiming for plan adoption this year. That's a 2021 plan. So this work is, this project performance assessment was one phase that we did in 2019 or so. It was done in 2018, 2019, and it was primarily actually led by Anoop Tapase, who's presented on this project performance assessment here to the November Planning Committee. And so that's sort of setting the context. And the purpose of the project performance assessment was to understand how major transportation investments would fare in an uncertain future. And this is new to this particular regional plan. The last regional plan, we also did a project performance assessment, but in this one we expanded it and combined it with futures planning, which was the previous phase, even before project performance assessment, where we sort of explored 3 what-if scenarios around, there's so much uncertainty as to what's going to happen in terms of all kinds of things, in terms of the federal, what's going on in federal government framework, taxing, climate, all that stuff. And we wanted to make sure that we included some more concrete uncertainty analysis in our project performance assessment. So that's kind of there's a lot of discussion here about the different conditions. We analyze this in the 3 futures. And so for every single project, we analyze their benefits and costs in the 3 futures. And it was very collaborative. As you can imagine, a project performance situation has a lot of stakeholders, and they are very invested in the outcomes of this. So there was a lot of discussion. The projects came from a number of sponsors, which were other agencies. And also there were projects that could be submitted by the public. So we evaluated 12 projects that were submitted from NGOs and the public, and not just from agency partners. So this was kind of the timeline. And I'll go through these fast. These slides are actually from Anoop's presentation to the committee, and then I've inserted some more modeling specific slides in here. So that's why they're so glossy and pretty. I didn't make these. So yes, okay, next slide. Just this slide just goes to show that there's a bunch of things that we did, a lot of projects that we did not evaluate because they were already included in the committed baseline. And these are probably more interesting to Bay Area folks, so I won't go through that in detail, but there was a committed baseline that had a bunch of projects included already. And then this is getting more into what we did as far as the project performance benefit cost assessment. So obviously we were trying to assess for each future, was a project cost effective and resilient in terms of the benefit cost. There was an equity assessment that was really important, and that was new in this plan. We didn't do that in the previous plan, and that was based on assessing the accessibility improvements. And we measured accessibility improvements via log sums, and there we have a TRB paper that we did in the previous plan, but in this plan we looked at the log sums by income group specifically to give projects an equity score. So if greater than 60% of the project accessibility benefits went to lower income households, then we said that it advances equity. And we also had if benefits were evenly distributed, then it was even. If benefits were skewed towards higher income groups, then we noted that the project challenged equity. And then finally, there was a lot of stakeholder discussion, and we had to add sort of, well, we didn't have to, but we added a qualitative assessment so that you could, so projects could be flagged for not being aligned with Plan Bay Area 2050's vision or guiding principles. And so that was kind of to get at the fact that there's a lot of stuff that's not modelable. And then this is a little bit more detail on the benefit cost assessment. As I mentioned already, there were the accessibility benefits through the log sums. And we did that because, the log sums, the destination choice log sums really get at all of the attributes that go into the utility of a model. And so we wanted to be able to capture all of those things and not just cost or travel time or, certain individual things. There were some items that didn't factor into the accessibility. So we also calculated the benefits from those, and those are listed here. I don't know if I have more. If you have more questions on that, we can talk about it. And then this is sort of, I think this is helpful because this is sort of the disclaimer slide where we like to make sure we are completely aware that models have limitations and that we're not trying to say we know everything because we have these models. And we look at other things too. And but the models are a good tool to analyze a lot of this stuff. So, and I'm going to talk about the modeling. This is my slide here. This is the modeling slide. And actually, here we go. I skipped this one, I think. Just to give a little bit of context about those 3 what if futures. These are the 3 what if futures that we used for the project performance assessment. So rising tides, falling fortunes was kind of more similar to today's climate, or today's just sort of more of a straight line forecast, although not exactly. I'll note that all of these did have different total regional control sort of growth forecasts. So we tried to make them pretty different. These what if scenarios came out of a collaborative stakeholder process. So we didn't just make these up. There were workshops and things like that where a bunch of folks in the Bay Area who worked at, who are in different agencies came together and put together these 3 futures. And then we tried to model them as well as we could. Clean and green is sort of a future where there's a lot of AV, EV penetration. It's kind of more, science fiction, maybe sort of utopia, unless you really love driving, I suppose, because it's more expensive to drive, more urban housing preferences. And then back to the future is the high growth scenario, dispersed housing, more urban jobs, also high EV, AV penetration, inexpensive driving. So I guess I shouldn't have said rising tides, falling fortunes was the closest to today. It was only closest today in sort of some things, but I think it's also a little bit of a negative thing where reduced regulations makes it more, we're more vulnerable to climate change. So none of them were really like, not today. None of them were really sort of in the middle exactly, because the whole point was that we were trying to make them divergent. So back to this. Okay, so the modeling framework, basically we have the regional forecasts, and then as I said, it's for each of the futures, 3 futures. So we tried to integrate, you know, all these external forces, which include attributes like different immigration levels, the AV, EV penetration, sharing preferences in terms of how willing people are to share spaces in their traveling, how willing they are to use pooled rides or transit, versus how much they're like, stay away from me. I think, unfortunately, we did all this work and we didn't think about something like a pandemic, but you can see how that would definitely possibly change some of these external forces. So we have the regional forecast, which we did for each of the futures, and then we fed that into Bay Area Urban Sim, our small area land use model for each of the 3 futures, and then we constructed a future baseline for each of the 3 futures, and then for each of those, we ran through our project definitions, so around 100 projects. So we basically we ended up doing around 300 model runs, and then both the baseline and the with project results were compared, and the differences were compiled into project benefits, and then the project costs fed into that as well to create the project benefit cost ratios for each project. So it was a lot of work. And this is an example, I just put this screenshot up here where in our, you know, we automated like everything. And this is actually, this is our COBRA worksheet, which I kind of put this snake in here as a joke. In the first round of project performance assessment, which is in the previous cycle, and it stayed ever since. And that's the cost benefit results analyzer. But every time we did a run, this would come out of it automatically. And this wasn't used, this was the workbook version was more used by planners to sort of understand and really dig into the results of what was driving these things. And it evolved over time. And the Anoop, you know, instrumented this quite a bit in terms of adding more complicated benefit cost sort of monetary calculations in here. But this was sort of our debug tool. And then we also had a sort of CSV. I'm figuring modelers might care about this stuff, so I'm giving a little bit of the technical detail. But we also basically the way that it would do it is it would spit out these Excel, and that was more for debugging, and then it would also spit out CSV type outputs as well that we would roll up into Tableau, so you could see sort of all the 3 futures and all the projects in one sort of roll up, and then most of that was done in Tableau. So some modeling highlights and challenges to handle the complexity of this coding, the network coding. We used our Python-based tool, Network Wrangler. This is for those who know about Network Wrangler. There's a Network Wrangler 2 that we're moving to, and this is kind of the first version of it that I also used and helped to develop when I was at San Francisco County Transportation Authority. So I brought that along with me, and that's basically coding each project in a series of scripts and input files so that you can just run a script and it'll say, take this baseline, apply this project, spit out the new network. And so then each project was coded that way, and you could sort of easily add it to any baseline and move it forward. And the other thing is, you know, as we were coding these 100 projects and having to put them in the 3 different baselines, a lot of times we would find a problem with a baseline. That's pretty typical, where we would realize we had to fix the baseline. So we would iterate on the baseline too, but not as frequently. I think at the end we were on baseline 16 for each of the 3 futures. So it was more than 300 runs. It was was a lot of work in the retrospect. And each model run took about 12 to 24 hours. We didn't do any simplified short version of the model run because in the previous plan, we had tried that and found that to be too error prone and not really worth it. So instead we worked with Cube to get an Amazon image, and we were able to run it on Amazon, so we could run, you know, I think at our peak, we had maybe 30 Amazon servers that we would just be churning these model runs through. And we had so many that we had to do that Anoop, who is our planner running this project, instead of him having to wait for modelers, the human resource was also a real issue in this. He would actually we were like, if you want to run the model and it's ready to go and someone's QA'd the inputs, you can just run it yourself. And here's how you log into Amazon, and here's how you run it. And so he was running them too. And so that was really, really awesome. So there was a lot of really close collaboration with the non-modeling staff. And then the other thing that I thought was an interesting aspect is the sea level rise was included in the futures. So the three different futures had different levels of sea level rise. But when we got to sort of running the project performance assessment with the sea level rise included, we realized it was having such a strong effect on the projects. And it was basically like this was an issue of the resilience project interfering or having, you know, having it out, whether or not you included resilience projects has an outside effect on the benefits or costs of the projects that are, you know, affected at all by sea level rises, including all the land use effects. And so, so fairly early in the process, we changed course on that and realized that we had to sort of not deal with the sea level rise changes on the land use and the networks for project performance because it was making too big of an effect. And so we did pull that. And then to the findings, I won't spend a huge amount of time on this because they're probably more interesting to Bay Area folks. But when we did release the findings, it was a contentious process because everybody cares about their projects. But we did find that, you know, a lot of projects had different scores in the different futures. And to Alex's point about the combination of projects, which I just saw in the chat, that definitely came up, and it was sort of something that was discussed in the findings that like there were a lot of projects which would make sense with other projects. And so I think, and there were also projects where some of the findings in terms of the issues that were affecting the project or making its benefit worse could be, you know, mitigated by another project or doing additional action. So there was a lot of discussion like that, and the discussion was really robust afterwards. So, but the overall lower cost transit improvements, not terribly surprisingly, were a win. The sea level rise protections were a big win. There were, the high cost rail projects tended to have worse equity outcomes and tended to be very more successful in the sort of high growth futures. And so you could see that there was some risk associated with them. And some projects have synergies while other projects compete with each other. And then we did, of course, look at pricing strategies, and we did look at them sort of relevant to the previous presentation. We looked at them with discounts, toll discounts, because the equity issue was such a big deal. Transit fare reforms, we did some modeling of that, although it's a tough one to model because there's a lot of, I think, aspects of that we don't model in terms of, you know, we don't have good studies or data to indicate sort of what the psychological impact of having a much simplified transit fare structure are. So it's more just the monetary value of a different fare structure. And micromobility, that one was trickier to model also. I could talk about that in a little bit more detail, but because the travel model 1.5 doesn't really capture micromobility that well. So I think for some of the projects were, not modelable, and we had to do analysis outside of it. And then this is kind of how the presentation of the final assessment findings were, in terms of there was a benefit cost ratio with the red, yellow, and green scale, and then the equity score, which is challenges, even, or advances. And then I think I'll close it there.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. That's a lot to digest. That's great work.
There's a lot
For
to,
sure.
I think I just threw it out at you, but.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's, like drinking from a fire hydrant, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we, in the metro region up here in Portland, we have developed a benefit cost tool as well, although the implementation is in, I would call it, infancy stage, not quite yet up to where you guys are at. I'm wondering, and I'll address the chat questions in a minute, but since I'm moderator, I get to ask my questions first. I'm assuming that this then gets moved, these scoring, I guess, the scoring of projects gets moved to ultimate designation in the RTP. Is that kind of where these projects are headed?
Yes. So yes, exactly. That's exactly what happened. So that has been done already. So I don't think that it was as straightforward as like any threshold or cutoff or anything like that. I think it was more a series of conversations that that the planners had with the stakeholders and so forth.
Yeah.
And they whittled down the project list to a set of projects that we modeled in the RTP.
Now, as you mentioned, I can only imagine how contentious some of those outcomes may have been. Was there a process by which an agency that may have submitted a project could go back and redesign it to try and get a better ratio, one that aligns maybe favorably for getting approved? Or I'm wondering if process had happened or was allowed, I guess.
Right. I would say we had to push back on that from a workload standpoint, because if we were too generous about that, then I think everyone would just be like, well, how about you try this, and how about you try that, and then we would never be done. So I think there was a lot of discussion up front when they were submitting their project scope to really figure that out as much as possible. And then I think in terms of redoing projects it was more of a question of like, if we had missed something and we talked to them and we had missed something in the modeling, then we would investigate that. And so we did have sort of this tail end of modeling where there were a few things that we had to keep kind of going over. But it wasn't, we definitely were we pushed back pretty hard on doing that.
Yeah.
A lot, because it was already so much work.
Yeah, that's an infinite loop. I mean, for as long as you say the model runs took, I mean, the outreach must have been even more so, right?
Right, absolutely. And I wasn't even, I mean, luckily for the modelers, we didn't get sort of pulled into those conversations with the sort of pushing back about, I mean, basically everyone who didn't get the score they were hoping for was gonna challenge us, and then we would have to. I think our planners had to, especially a new peeler, he basically became a travel modeler through this process because he had to explain so much detail, and he coded projects and he ran the model. And so and I think that level of like digging in was really necessary. And he dug into a lot of results. Like we would look at accessibility maps constantly and try to figure out, you know, does this thing make sense, or is this an artifact of a modeling problem, or is this, you know, something that we should, and there were things that were artifacts of modeling problems occasionally that we would have to sort of negate, so it wasn't a legitimate issue.
On the topic, this will be my last question for now, and then if you could leave your contact information in the chat, because I'd like
absolutely.
I'd like to follow up with you on some other topics related to this as well. But my last question is around those log sums that you mentioned and the accessibility. I'm wondering, since you decided to go with the destination choice log sums, I'm wondering what other accessibility measures you were entertaining to use besides the log sums. And maybe if you could just talk briefly about how you're monetizing the log sums as well.
Right. So I think initially we had looked more at travel time and travel cost, but and we wrote a paper, a TRB paper, during the previous RTP about using log sums as our accessibility measure for project performance assessment and why we did that. So there's a lot of information there about sort of why we tended to go this way. But I mean, I would say that, you know, the models and the mode choice models have so many aspects in them, so many elements in them that are not just travel time and travel cost. And we were finding that you would get sort of, if you focus too much on travel time or travel costs, you would get sort of these counterintuitive results where you could add transit and somebody might take it and it's a lot slower. And so so if you're looking at travel time, they're losing, but they made that choice because their utility is higher, because they don't just care about travel time, they care about all kinds of things. And so so we would get counterintuitive results if we use something else, and we were like, well, you know, people are making these choices to switch because they're gaining something, and those gains are represented in the utility. And so if we use something that doesn't capture all the aspects, all the, you know, items in the utility, then we come up with weird results, and that was just not working out for us.
Yeah,
so
that makes a lot of sense. The challenge here has been around just describing log sums to the a person, right? Travel time's easy, 30 minutes on transit, or
right,
certain threshold of time or cost, and you know, I think that's easy for people to put their arms around and understand.
And we did have some public meetings where people sort of jokingly mocked us if we ever used the word log sum. So we try not to use the word log sum, and we would say something like an accessibility measure that encapsulates all these different things, and then sort of list them. And so that was definitely some terminology that we had to work a lot to explain.
Yeah.
And yes, for sure.
Yes. Okay. Well, and it looks like maybe you added some gradations to that accessibility too, which I thought was helpful too. You know, if you had greater than 60% accessibility, you fell in this category. I think that was maybe a good way to move out of the log sum nomenclature and more into the accessibility and kind of scale it relatively to each other. I thought that was helpful as well. All right, let me move to, in the interest of time here, let me move to a few of the questions. I need to scroll up here. Okay, I think you addressed Alex's question about modeling separately. So Ray Jackson from Mid-Willamette Valley COG, which is down in Salem, Oregon, just to give you geographic context here, Lisa. Ray asked, in the benefits and cost slide, it showed that rehab of a project was included. Can you elaborate on how that was estimated, I guess, yeah, cost-wise?
Rehab. Let me take a look which project. I think the rehab project was around sort of this, I believe, I'm guessing that you're talking about, there's this project that's like a roadway segment that's really important, but it gets flooded all the time. So it's kind of been like not reliable. So that's a good question. I'm not sure about the details of that exactly, other than I think that we modeled the link as sort of not being there and being there, you know, as rehab, and then maybe that was I'm not entirely sure. So I'm guessing, because it was both a while ago, and also the detail of individual projects was like much more in Anoop's world and much less in my world. But there were some things where the modeling was less straightforward, and so maybe there was a scaling of the results. Like I know we had difficulty with projects that benefited users outside of the region, because, you know, in our travel modeling, we're not really representing those people as simulated individuals. And so I think for things like that, there was some scaling, maybe 1.5 times the benefit or something like that, based on sort of stakeholder discussion. And so I think for the rehab type of project, it might have been something along those lines, although I can't totally be sure.
Yeah. Okay.
So no promises. I might be wrong, but I think that might have been what took place.
All right. Let's
get more information if you really want to know, though.
Ray, are you there? I mean, do you want to jump in? Does that suffice, or do you want to?
I guess the question was the slide was for cost and benefits, and it seemed like it was implying that as a cost, you were somehow including the rehab or the reconstruction of a project within the time frame of the plan. And I was just,
I see. You're talking about the cost.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. That's different. So the cost projection over time, I believe they did try to incorporate a pretty robust projection of costs to maintain the facility over time, which in some cases would include, you know, higher maintenance costs than other projects, depending on what the project was. So I think they did a pretty in-depth look at the assets and what it costs to keep that you know, asset in state of good repair throughout the life of the study period. And that was done outside of the model. So the cost stuff was like all planners, and then we just, you know, they sort of plugged it in after the fact in Tableau. So that was sort of their own input, because the modeling side was the benefits.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Next question, Alex. Really interesting to hear the findings on light rail, because there are a lot of strong backers to light rail. Can you speak to how those conversations went? For example, what was it like to discuss that light rail might be a project that benefits the rich?
I mean, I think that those were fairly contentious, and that was also sort of, I think, true for commuter rail projects as well. They also tend to have sort of challenging equity scores, but I think that those conversations were challenging, but I also think that there were a lot of people who really appreciated that we talked about that, and that we didn't just, you know, say, you know, benefits, yay. We looked more specifically at who received those benefits and how much, you know, I think the equity score overall was really appreciated by stakeholders, as a way to honestly confront those kinds of issues. So while I wasn't really directly involved in a lot of those conversations, my impression is that was contentious, but also a lot of people appreciated it.
Were you guys able to weight the different benefits differently based on maybe the priorities of the decision-making body or the criteria with which you scored the projects?
I think that we tried to make sure that the benefits sort of encapsulated the, 5 sort of goals of the plan. But we didn't weight them outside of that, and we really weighted them based on sort of a valuation of what that benefit was, so it's translated into dollars. And to your point earlier, you were asking about the accessibility. We did translate the log sum accessibilities into a dollar value. And we did not, the dollar value was the same for all income levels, because we did not want to say that we as an agency value increased accessibility. Like we as an agency value increased accessibility for all income levels the same, regardless of what their value of time is.
Okay.
And there is documentation on what those valuations are for each of the measures and where they came from. So if anyone's interested, there's a lot of very detailed methodology, because all the methodology stuff had to be decided up front before we really launched into the modeling. And so these sort of terms were negotiated early on.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, anything, Lisa, that, you've mentioned a couple of documents. If you could, as you think of it while we're online here, if you could just send us a quick link in the chat.
Absolutely.
People would appreciate it. And maybe while you're doing that, I'll read off what I think is the last question for you from Tara at ODOT. Interesting to see, or interesting how we can't control sea level pricing, gas, or lower operating costs with electric vehicles are more significant than we can control. Makes it important to talk about what might happen and how responses or best projects to fund might change the concept benefits of your work, resulting discussion, other insights in dealing with uncertainty. I think at this point, I'm gonna ask Tara to maybe unmute and articulate maybe a little bit more, better than I'm doing at least, some of the insights and reactions that you had from Lisa's talk. Are you there, Tara?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Lisa. Yeah, so I guess, my big thing is, I think, you studied 3 futures to test resilience. So what's the bottom line you found from that uncertainty? I think there's a lot of sort of concept value. And so kind of wanting to contrast, none of those futures is real, but there's so much we can't control, some of which you decided at one point to just drop out. And I understand that. So like, what did you leave with in terms of understanding uncertainty and how that was relayed in a conversation with the group? And is there next steps you're doing on that?
Sorry, thank you, I am muted. So even though we did leave the sea level rise out, the auto operating costs were different. The sharing, these preferences were different. The land use was different, and the land use is probably the biggest thing. And I think you could sort of tell, and not surprisingly, that the land use affected things quite a bit, because a lot of these very expensive high capacity projects are really dependent on the land use intensity and how much that is and where it's forecast. And also, the sort of modal specific parts of the sort of high operating, high auto operating costs is a very, really means that there was a lot of transit crowding and a lot of transit use in that particular future. And so to me, it really was about how these projects how much they are affected and how robust they are to those types of things, because we don't know if we're going to have a low growth future, and we don't know what auto operating cost is going to be like. And if a project really pencils out really well only in those circumstances, but not in other circumstances, I think that's interesting to know. So I think that those ended up being sort of the strongest signals, is the land use part of it, and things like auto operating costs, and and that type of forecast.
Great, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tara and Lisa. Let's see, we have about 5 minutes left, and I was given 10 on the agenda, so I'm going to make them really quick. But before I leave, I want to echo what Peter wrote in the chat room, which is great presentations by everybody today. This was